How your daily actions are quietly controlling your entire life. This is where you win or lose the viewer. The goal is tension, relatability, and curiosity. You wake up. You check your phone. You scroll without thinking. You tell yourself you'll change tomorrow. But tomorrow looks exactly the same. This is not a lack of discipline. This is not laziness. This is programming. Right now, there is a system running in the background of your life. A system built from repeated actions. Your habits. And whether you realize it or not, those habits are deciding your future for you. This is the habit code. And today, you're going to see exactly how it works. And how to take back control. There is something controlling your life right now. It is not your thoughts. It is not your goal. It is not even your decision. It is something quieter. Something repetitive. Something you stopped noticing a long time ago. Your habits. Before we begin, if you are new here, subscribe to Mind Lab Audiobooks. This channel is built to rewire how you think, how you act, and ultimately how you live. Because the truth is simple. If you do not take control of your mind, something else will. Now listen carefully. Every day, you wake up and repeat patterns. You follow routines. You react in familiar ways. You make choices that feel natural. But what if those choices are not really choices? What if they are pre-written scripts? What if your entire life is being quietly shaped by a hidden system you never learned to control? This is the habit code. And once you see it, you will never look at your life the same way again. Introduction. Most people believe their life is shaped by the big moments. The major decisions. The turning points. The risks they take or avoid. They point to visible events. A career choice. A relationship. A success. A failure. And they assume that these moments define everything. But this belief is incomplete. Because what you see on the surface is only the result. The real cause exists beneath it. Your life is not built in moments. It is built in patterns. Not in what you do once, but in what you repeat every single day. The problem is that repetition does not feel powerful. It feels ordinary. It feels harmless. It feels easy to ignore. Waking up and checking your phone does not feel like a defining action. Skipping one opportunity does not feel like a life-changing mistake. Delaying your goals does not feel like you are moving backward. But habits do not work in isolation. They work in accumulation. Each small action may seem insignificant on its own. But together, they create direction. And direction, over time, becomes destiny. This is where most people lose control. Not because they lack ambition, but because they underestimate repetition. They focus on intensity. They chase motivation. They wait for the right moment. But life does not respond to intensity. It responds to consistency. You can be highly motivated for a day and see no real change. But repeated behavior, even at a low level, will always produce results. This is why habits are more powerful than goals. Goals give you a target. But habits determine whether you ever reach it. You can set the best goals in the world. But if your daily actions do not support them, they remain ideas. And ideas do not build reality. Systems do. Your habits are the system behind your life. They decide how you spend your time. They decide how you respond to pressure. They decide whether you move forward or stay in place. And most of this happens without conscious awareness. That is the most dangerous part. Because you cannot change what you do not see. You cannot control what you do not understand. And if you are not paying attention, your habits will quietly shape your future for you. Not based on what you want, but based on what you repeat. This is why people often feel stuck without knowing why. They have goals. They have ideas. They have intentions. But their daily actions tell a different story. They delay when they should act. They avoid when they should confront. They distract themselves when they should focus. And over time, these patterns become normal. They stop questioning them. They accept them as part of who they are. This is where the shift happens. A behavior becomes a habit. A habit becomes a pattern. A pattern becomes an identity. And once it becomes an identity, it becomes difficult to change. Because now you are not just changing what you do. You are changing who you believe you are. This is why most attempts at change fail. People try to force new actions without changing the system behind them. They rely on willpower. They rely on motivation. They rely on temporary bursts of discipline. But these are unstable forces. They come and go. They depend on emotion. And emotion is unpredictable. Habits are not. Habits are stable. They are consistent. They operate whether you feel like it or not. And that is exactly why they are so powerful. They can build your life automatically. Or they can quietly limit it. Without asking for your permission. Without announcing their impact. Just through repetition. This audiobook is about exposing that system. It is about making the invisible visible. It is about showing you how your daily actions are not random. They are coded, structured, predictable, controllable. This is what we call the habit code. The underlying framework that drives your behavior. Once you understand this code, something changes. You begin to see patterns where you once saw randomness. You begin to notice triggers behind your actions. You begin to recognize how small behaviors connect to larger outcomes. And most importantly, you begin to realize that your life is not fixed. It is programmed. And anything that is programmed can be reprogrammed. That is where control begins. Not in forcing change, but in understanding the system that creates it. Because once you understand the system, you no longer rely on luck. You no longer depend on motivation. You begin to design your behavior with intention. You begin to align your actions with the person you want to become. And over time, that alignment becomes automatic. This is the shift from reacting to your life to build it. From being controlled by habits to control them. And everything that follows in this audiobook is designed to take you through that transformation. Step by step. From awareness to understanding to control. So before we move forward, there is one idea you must accept. Your life is not the result of what you want. It is the result of what you repeat. And if you want to change your life, you must first change your habits. Now we begin. Chapter 1: The Invisible System Running Your Life. There is a version of your life that is already being written. Not in the future. Not someday. But right now. It is being written in the quiet moments. In the small decisions you barely notice. In the actions you repeat without thinking. Most people believe they are in control of their life. They believe their future will be shaped by big decisions. A new job. A bold move. A major breakthrough. But that belief hides a deeper truth. Your life is not built in dramatic moments. It is built in silent repetitions. The way you wake up. The way you start your morning. The way you respond to discomfort. The way you spend your time when no one is watching. These patterns may feel insignificant. But they are not. They are the system. And that system is running your life. Every day, your brain looks for efficiency. It wants to save energy. It wants to avoid unnecessary effort. So it creates shortcuts. Instead of thinking through every action, it builds patterns. Instead of deciding every time, it automates behavior. This is how habits are formed. First, you choose your actions. But over time, your actions begin to choose you. What once required effort becomes automatic. What once required awareness becomes unconscious. And this is where control begins to fade. Because when something becomes automatic, you stop questioning it. You stop analyzing it. You stop noticing it. It simply runs. This is why habits are powerful. They remove friction. They create consistency. They allow you to function without constant decision-making. But there is another side to this power. Because habits do not care whether they are helping you or hurting you. They do not evaluate outcomes. They do not adjust based on your goals. They only do one thing. They repeat. If the pattern is useful, it will build your life. If the pattern is destructive, it will slowly break it. And the most dangerous part is this: you will not notice it happening. There is no alarm when your habits are damaging your future. There is no warning when your routines are limiting your potential. It happens quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. This is why people wake up years later and feel stuck. Not because they made one bad decision, but because they repeated small ones, over and over again. Think about your current life, your energy levels, your focus, your discipline, your results. All of it is a reflection of your daily patterns. Not your intentions, not your plans, not your ambitions, your patterns. You may want to be productive, but if your habits lead you to distraction, distraction will win. You may want to be healthy, but if your habits lead you to neglect your body, decline will follow. You may want to succeed, but if your habits are inconsistent, your results will be inconsistent. The system always wins. Not because it is smarter, but because it is constant. This is the invisible force most people underestimate. Consistency is more powerful than intensity. A single day of effort does not change your life, but repeated behavior does. And repetition does not require motivation. It requires structure. This is why motivation alone fails. Motivation is emotional. It rises and falls. It depends on how you feel at the moment. But habits are mechanical. They operate whether you feel like it or not. They do not ask for permission. They do not wait for the right mood. They execute. And that execution shapes your reality. Now consider this carefully. If your habits are aligned with your goals, your life will move forward automatically. You will not need constant discipline. You will not need to force progress every day. The system will carry you. But if your habits are misaligned, your life will move in the wrong direction just as automatically. Even if you try to resist. Even if you try to correct it occasionally. Because the system is stronger than isolated effort. This is why people feel trapped. They try to change their life through willpower. They try to push harder. They try to stay motivated. But they are fighting a system with emotion. And emotion is unstable. Systems are stable. So the system wins. Every time. To understand this deeper, you must see habits for what they truly are. They are not just actions. They are identity signals. Every time you repeat a behavior, you reinforce a version of yourself. When you delay, you reinforce avoidance. When you focus, you reinforce discipline. When you quit, you reinforce weakness. When you persist, you reinforce strength. These signals accumulate. And over time, they become your identity. Not the identity you want, but the identity you practice. This is why change feels so difficult. You are not just trying to change what you do. You are trying to change who you have been becoming. And identity resists change. Because identity seeks consistency. Your brain wants your actions to match your self-image. So if you see yourself as someone who lacks discipline, your behavior will align with that belief. If you see yourself as someone who is inconsistent, your habits will reflect that. Even if you try to act differently for a short time. Because deep down, the system is still running the old code. This is the invisible system most people never confront. They focus on outcomes, but ignore patterns. They chase results, but avoid structure. They try to change their life, but refuse to change their habits. And without changing the system, nothing changes. Now here is the turning point. Once you become aware of this system, you gain power. Because awareness breaks automation. When you notice a habit, it is no longer completely unconscious. When you observe your patterns, you interrupt the loop. And in that interruption, there is a moment of control. A small moment, but a critical one. Because that is where change begins. Not in massive action, but in conscious awareness. If you can see the system, you can question it. If you can question it, you can adjust it. If you can adjust it, you can rebuild it. And that is how you take control of your life. Not by forcing outcomes, but by redesigning the system that creates them. Because once the system changes, everything changes. Your behavior changes. Your identity shifts. Your results follow. But it all begins here. With one realization. You are not controlled by what you want. You are controlled by what you repeat. Chapter 1 Summary. Your life is shaped more by repetition than by intention. Habits operate as automatic systems that influence your behavior without requiring conscious effort. These systems can either build your future or slowly limit your potential, depending on the patterns you repeat daily. Awareness is the first step to regaining control. Once you recognize your habits, you create the opportunity to change them. Lessons to practice. Observe your behavior throughout the day without trying to change it. Focus on what you actually do, not what you plan to do. Identify one repeated habit that defines your current lifestyle. Determine whether it is moving you forward or holding you back. Pay attention to moments where you act automatically. Notice triggers that lead to specific behaviors. Create one small interruption in a routine. Pause and choose a different action, even once. Understand that control begins with awareness, not force. Transition to Chapter 2. You have now uncovered the system. You have seen how habits operate in the background. How they repeat. How they shape your identity. But this raises a deeper question. If habits are this powerful, what exactly is the code behind them? What structure makes them so consistent? So automatic? So difficult to break? Because habits are not random behaviors. They follow a pattern. A framework. A code. And once you understand that code, you gain the ability to rewrite it. Now we move to Chapter 2. The habit code defined. Chapter 2. The habit code defined. There is a reason your habits feel automatic. There is a reason you repeat behaviors even when you know they are not serving you. There is a reason change feels difficult, inconsistent, and often temporary. It is not because you lack discipline. It is not because you lack intelligence. It is not because you are incapable. It is because you are operating within a system you do not fully understand. That system is the habit code. The habit code is the underlying structure that governs every repeated behavior in your life. It is not visible. It is not something you were taught. But it is always running. Every habit you have follows this code. Every routine you repeat is built on it. And whether you realize it or not, this code is shaping your identity in real time. To understand it, you must stop seeing habits as simple actions. Habits are not random behaviors. They are structured loops. They follow a predictable sequence. A sequence that, once activated, moves from beginning to end without requiring conscious effort. This is why habits feel effortless once they are established. Because they are no longer decisions. They are executions. The habit code is built on 3 core elements. Trigger. Action. Reinforcement. Every habit you perform is a loop that moves through these 3 stages. First, there is a trigger. This is the starting point. The signal. The moment that activates the behavior. It can be external. A notification on your phone. A specific time of day. A location. A person. Or it can be internal. A feeling of boredom. Stress. Anxiety. Fatigue. The trigger is what tells your brain that it is time to begin a pattern. Without a trigger, there is no habit. But once the trigger appears, the system begins to move. Then comes the action. This is the behavior itself. The thing you do in response to the trigger. You pick up your phone. You open an app. You eat something. You avoid a task. You start working. You go for a walk. The action is what most people focus on. They believe that changing the action is the key to changing the habit. But this is where most people fail. Because the action is only one part of the code. And it is not the strongest part. The final element is reinforcement. This is the outcome that tells your brain whether the habit is worth repeating. It can be a pleasure, relief, distraction, comfort, or even something as simple as reducing discomfort. This reinforcement is what locks the habit into place. Because your brain is always learning. It is always asking one question. Did this help me feel better or survive more efficiently? If the answer is yes, even slightly, the brain stores the pattern. And the next time the same trigger appears, it will run the same behavior again. This is how habits are formed. Not through logic, but through repetition and reward. Over time, this loop becomes faster. The trigger is recognized instantly. The action follows without thought. The reinforcement strengthens the connection. And eventually, the entire process becomes automatic. This is the habit code in motion. Now here is where it becomes powerful. Once a habit is encoded, it does not disappear easily. Even if you try to stop the action. Even if you are aware of the behavior. Because the code is still stored. The trigger still exists. The reinforcement still holds value. So the system keeps trying to execute. This is why breaking habits feels like resistance. You are not just stopping an action. You are interrupting a loop that your brain has optimized. And the brain does not like inefficiency. It will push you back toward what is familiar. Toward what is known. Toward what has worked before. Even if it is not helping you anymore. This is why people repeat behaviors they know are harmful. Not because they want to fail, but because the habit code is still active. And it is stronger than intention alone. Now consider this carefully. If every habit follows this structure, then every habit can be understood. And if it can be understood, it can be changed. But only if you stop focusing on the surface. Most people try to change habits by attacking the action. They try to force themselves to behave differently. They rely on discipline. They rely on motivation. But they ignore the trigger. They ignore the reinforcement. And because of that, the system remains intact. So the behavior returns. To truly change a habit, you must work with the code. Not against it. You must identify the trigger. What starts the behavior? Is it a time of day? A specific emotion? A particular environment? Then you must examine the action. What exactly are you doing in response? And finally, you must understand the reinforcement. What are you gaining? Is it relief? Is it distraction? Is it comfort? Because if the reward remains valuable, the habit will continue to exist. Even if you try to suppress it. This is the key insight. You do not eliminate habits. You replace them. You keep the trigger. You change the action. You maintain or redesign the reinforcement. That is how you rewrite the code. That is how you take control. Now there is one more layer to this system. With enough repetition, the habit code begins to shape your identity. At first, you perform the habit. But over time, the habit begins to define you. You do not just act disciplined. You become someone who is disciplined. You do not just avoid work. You become someone who procrastinates. This shift is subtle. But it is powerful. Because once a behavior becomes part of your identity, it becomes even harder to change. Now you are not just changing an action. You are challenging who you believe you are. And identity is one of the strongest forces in human behavior. This is why lasting change requires more than effort. It requires alignment. Your habits must align with the person you want to become. And your identity must support the habits you are trying to build. This is the deeper level of the habit code. It does not just control what you do. It shapes who you are. And if you do not consciously design it, it will be designed by default. By your environment. By your past behavior. By repetition. So the question is no longer whether habits control your life. They do. The real question is this. Are you running the code? Or is the code running you? Chapter 2 Summary. Habits follow a structured loop made of trigger, action, and reinforcement. This loop operates automatically once it is established, making behaviors feel effortless and consistent. Most people fail to change habits because they focus only on the action and ignore the full system. True change happens when you understand and rewrite the entire habit code. Lessons to practice. Identify one habit you repeat daily. Break it down into trigger, action, and reinforcement. Observe what initiates the behavior. Pay attention to time, location, and emotional state. Analyze what reward you receive after the action. Even small rewards reinforce patterns. Experiment with replacing the action while keeping the same trigger. Test alternative behaviors that provide a similar reward. Understand that lasting change requires working with the system, not against it. Transition to Chapter 3. Now you understand the code. You see the structure behind every habit. You recognize the loop, the trigger, the action, the reinforcement. But there is a deeper problem. Because once this code is repeated enough times, something happens. The system speeds up. It becomes faster, more efficient, more automatic. Until one day, you are no longer choosing your behavior at all. You are simply following it. Now we move to Chapter 3. The Automation Trap. Chapter 3. The Automation Trap. There is a moment in every habit where choice disappears. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But gradually. At first, every action requires effort. You think about it. You decide to do it. You push yourself to follow through. But repetition changes something. What once required attention begins to require less. What once felt difficult begins to feel normal. What once demanded effort begins to feel automatic. And eventually, something subtle happens. You stop choosing. You start following. This is the automation trap. It is the point where your habits become so efficient that they no longer need your awareness. They run on their own. And while that may sound like an advantage, it comes with a hidden cost. Because when behavior becomes automatic, it also becomes unquestioned. You no longer pause to evaluate it. You no longer ask if it is helping you. You no longer consider whether it aligns with your goals. You simply repeat it. This is how people lose control without realizing it. Not through one major decision, but through thousands of small, automatic ones. Think about your daily routine. How much of it is actually chosen at the moment? The way you wake up. The first thing you do. The way you respond to your phone. The way you handle discomfort. The way you spend your free time. Most of it feels natural. But natural does not mean intentional. It means practice. It means repeated. It means automated. And the more automated your behavior becomes, the less control you actively exercise. This is the paradox of efficiency. The brain automates behavior to save energy. It reduces the need for decision-making. It simplifies your actions. It allows you to move through life faster. But in doing so, it removes awareness. And without awareness, there is no control. This is why people can live the same day over and over again without noticing. They wake up. They follow the same patterns. They react the same way. They repeat the same habits. And at the end of the day, nothing has truly changed. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. Months become years. And the system continues to run. This is the automation trap at its highest level. You are active, but not intentional. You are moving, but not progressing. You are repeating, but not evolving. Now consider this carefully. Automation itself is not the problem. In fact, it is necessary. Without automation, your brain would be overwhelmed. Every decision would require effort. Every action would demand attention. You would struggle to function efficiently. Automation allows you to operate. But the problem arises when automation is left unmanaged. When habits form without awareness. When patterns develop without intention. Because then the system builds itself. And it does not build based on your goals. It builds based on what is easiest. What is most comfortable. What provides immediate reward. This is why the automation trap often leads people in the wrong direction. Because the easiest behavior is rarely the most beneficial one. Comfort leads to repetition. Repetition leads to automation. Automation leads to identity. And identity locks the system in place. This is how people become trapped in cycles they do not understand. They are not choosing their behavior anymore. They are executing it. And execution without awareness leads to stagnation. Now there is another layer to this trap. Speed. As habits become more ingrained, the loop becomes faster. The trigger appears. The action follows instantly. The reinforcement is received. There is no pause in between. No space to think. No moment to intervene. The entire process happens in seconds. Sometimes in less than a second. This is why breaking habits feels so difficult. You are trying to interrupt something that happens faster than your awareness can catch it. By the time you realize what you are doing, it is already done. You have already checked your phone. You have already delayed your task. You have already fallen back into the pattern. And this creates frustration. Because it feels like you are losing control. But the reality is simpler. You are not losing control. You are operating on a system that has already been optimized for repetition. And optimized systems are hard to disrupt. They are designed to run smoothly. To avoid friction. To continue without interruption. So when you try to change a habit, you are introducing friction into a system that resists it. That resistance is not failure. It is the system doing exactly what it was designed to do. This is why awareness alone is not enough. You can know a habit is harmful. You can understand its impact. But if the system remains unchanged, the behavior will continue. Because knowledge does not override automation. Only structure does. To escape the automation trap, you must do something most people never do. You must slow the system down. You must create space between trigger and action. Because in that space, there is choice. And where there is choice, there is control. This is the critical shift. You are not trying to eliminate automation. You are trying to control it. You are trying to decide which behaviors deserve to become automatic. Because once a behavior becomes automatic, it will repeat without effort. So the real question is not whether you have habits. You always will. The question is whether your habits are working for you or against you. Because the automation trap does not care about direction. It only cares about repetition. It will reinforce whatever you practice. If you practice distraction, it will automate distraction. If you practice discipline, it will automate discipline. If you practice avoidance, it will automate avoidance. If you practice focus, it will automate focus. This is the law of repetition. What you do consistently becomes what you do automatically. And what you do automatically becomes who you are. This is why the automation trap is not just about behavior. It is about identity. Every automated action is a reinforcement of self. Every repeated pattern is a statement of who you are becoming. Not who you want to be, but who you are training yourself to be. And once that identity is established, the system becomes even stronger. Because now your habits are not just actions. They are expectations. Your brain expects you to behave in certain ways. And it will guide you back to those behaviors whenever you drift away. This is why temporary change is easy. But permanent change is difficult. Because temporary change happens at the level of action. Permanent change happens at the level of identity. And identity is built through automation. So if you want to take control of your life, you must take control of your automation. You must become aware of what is running in the background. You must identify the patterns that are repeating without your permission. And you must decide which ones deserve to stay. Because every automated habit is either building your future or quietly limiting it. There is no neutral repetition. Everything you repeat is shaping you. Now here is the final truth of this chapter. The automation trap is not something you fall into once. It is something you live in every day. Every habit you allow to run unchecked becomes part of that trap. Every pattern you ignore becomes part of that system. But the moment you become aware of it, something changes. You begin to see your behavior differently. You begin to notice patterns as they happen. You begin to recognize triggers before they fully take over. And in those moments, even if they are brief, you gain something powerful. A choice. And that choice is where freedom begins. Chapter 3 Summary. Habits become automatic through repetition, reducing the need for conscious decision-making. While automation increases efficiency, it also removes awareness, leading to unconscious behavior patterns. The automation trap occurs when habits run without evaluation, causing stagnation and misalignment with goals. Control is regained by creating space between trigger and action and consciously managing which behaviors become automatic. Lessons to practice. Notice moments where your actions feel automatic. Identify behaviors that happen without conscious thought. Slow down one routine during your day. Add a brief pause before acting. Create awareness between trigger and response. Even a few seconds of pause can interrupt automation. Choose one habit to consciously control today. Focus on performing it with full awareness. Understand that awareness creates choice. And choice is the foundation of control. Transition to Chapter 4. You now understand the danger of automation. You see how repetition removes choice. How habits begin to run without awareness. How identity is shaped in the background. But this leads to a deeper realization. If habits shape identity, then who you are is not fixed. It is built. And if it is built, it can be redesigned. Now we move to Chapter 4. Identity before action. Chapter 4. Identity before action. There is a belief most people carry without questioning it. If I change my actions, I will change my life. It sounds logical. It feels correct. It seems like the obvious path forward. But it is incomplete. Because actions do not exist in isolation. They are driven by something deeper. Something more stable. Something more powerful. Identity. Who you believe you are determines what you do. Not occasionally, but consistently. This is why lasting change does not begin with action. It begins with identity. Every behavior you repeat is a reflection of a belief about yourself. If you believe you are disciplined, your actions will align with discipline. If you believe you are inconsistent, your actions will reflect inconsistency. If you believe you are capable, you will take action. If you believe you are limited, you will hesitate. This is not a coincidence. It is alignment. Your brain is constantly working to keep your actions consistent with your identity. Because consistency creates stability. And stability is what the brain seeks. So even if you try to change your behavior, if it conflicts with your identity, the system will resist it. You may succeed for a short time. You may force yourself to act differently. But eventually, you return to what feels like you. This is why people struggle to maintain change. They try to build new habits on top of an old identity. They try to act disciplined while still believing they lack discipline. They try to stay consistent while still identifying as inconsistent. And this creates internal conflict. The behavior says one thing. The identity says another. And in the long run, identity wins. Because identity is not just a belief. It is a collection of repeated evidence. Every action you take is a vote. A vote for the type of person you believe you are. When you follow through, you reinforce reliability. When you quit, you reinforce doubt. When you stay focused, you reinforce discipline. When you avoid, you reinforce resistance. These votes accumulate. And over time, they form a self-image. Not based on what you want to believe, but based on what you have consistently done. This is why identity feels real. Because it is built on evidence. And once that evidence is strong enough, it becomes your default belief. Now here is where the shift begins. If your identity is built through repeated actions, then it can also be rebuilt through them. But the process must be intentional. You cannot wait for your identity to change before you act. You must act in a way that creates a new identity. This is the reversal most people never make. They wait to feel confident before taking action. They wait to feel ready before committing. But confidence does not come first. Evidence does. And evidence is created through action. Small actions. Repeated consistently. This is how identity is rewritten. Not through declarations. Not through motivation. But through proof. Every time you perform a behavior that aligns with the person you want to become, you cast a vote for that identity. At first, the vote feels weak. Because it is competing with years of past evidence. But repetition changes that. One action becomes 2. 2 becomes 10. 10 becomes a pattern. And eventually, the pattern becomes belief. This is when the shift happens. You no longer force the behavior. It becomes natural. Because now it aligns with who you believe you are. This is why identity-based habits are powerful. They do not rely on external pressure. They do not depend on motivation. They are supported by self-perception. And self-perception drives consistency. Now consider the opposite. If your identity is built on negative patterns, the system works against you. If you see yourself as someone who procrastinates, you will delay action. If you see yourself as someone who lacks discipline, you will avoid effort. Even if you try to change. Because the behavior must match the identity. This is the hidden barrier most people face. They are not fighting their habits. They are fighting their self-image. And self-image is reinforced every day through repetition. So if you want to change your life, you must address the root. Not just what you do, but how you see yourself. This does not mean pretending. It means building evidence. It means choosing actions that support the identity you want to create. Even when it feels uncomfortable. Even when it feels unfamiliar. Because identity change always feels unnatural at first. You are stepping outside of what is known. You are interrupting patterns that have been reinforced over time. But this discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of transition. It means you are moving from one identity to another. Now there is a critical principle you must understand. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And your systems are built on your identity. If your identity does not support your goals, your systems will not sustain them. You may achieve short-term success, but you will not maintain it. Because maintenance requires consistency. And consistency requires alignment. This is why people often achieve results and then lose them. They reach a goal. They experience success. But they have not changed their identity. So their habits pull them back. Back to what feels normal. Back to what feels familiar. This is not failure. It is a misalignment. The identity did not change. So the system reset. To create lasting change, identity must come first. Not as a belief you declare, but as a direction you build through action. You must decide who you are becoming. Not in vague terms, but in specific behaviors. What does a disciplined person do daily? What does a focused person avoid? What does a consistent person repeat? And then you begin. One action at a time. Each action is a vote. Each repetition is reinforcement. Each day is evidence. And over time, the evidence becomes identity. This is how you take control of your life. Not by chasing outcomes, but by becoming the type of person who produces them naturally. Because once identity is aligned, behavior follows automatically. And once behavior is consistent, results are inevitable. Chapter 4 Summary. Lasting change begins with identity, not action. Your habits reflect your self-image, and your brain works to keep your behavior aligned with that identity. Temporary change fails when actions conflict with deeply held beliefs about yourself. Identity is built through repeated actions, and it can be reshaped by consistently practicing behaviors that align with the person you want to become. Lessons to practice. Define the type of person you want to become. Focus on behaviors, not abstract ideas. Identify one habit that aligns with that identity. Commit to repeating it daily. View every action as a vote for your future self. Make choices that reinforce the identity you want. Do not wait to feel ready. Act first and allow confidence to follow. Track small wins as evidence. Use repetition to build belief over time. Transition to Chapter 5. You now understand that identity drives behavior. You see how actions reinforce who you believe you are. How repetition builds self-image. How alignment creates consistency. But there is still a missing piece. Because even identity-driven habits must begin somewhere. They do not appear randomly. They are triggered. There is always a starting point. A signal. A moment that activates the behavior. If you can control that moment, you can control the habit. Now we move to Chapter 5. The cue-response loop. Chapter 5, The Cue-Response Loop. Every habit begins before you are aware of it. Not at the moment of action. Not when you consciously decide to do something. But earlier. In a moment so small and subtle that most people never notice it. This moment is the cue. The starting point of every behavior. the signal that tells your brain what to do next. Without a cue, there is no habit. And yet, most people focus only on the action. They try to change what they do, without understanding what starts it. This is why change feels inconsistent. Because the trigger remains the same. And as long as the trigger remains, the system continues to activate. This is the cue-response loop. A continuous cycle where a signal leads to a behavior, and that behavior reinforces the signal. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. You no longer notice the cue. You only experience the action. But the cue is always there. And it is always in control. To understand this, you must begin to see your environment and your internal state differently. Because cues exist everywhere. They are built into your surroundings. They are tied to your emotions. They are connected to your routines. A specific location can become a cue. A certain time of day can trigger a behavior. A particular emotion can activate a pattern. You walk into a room and immediately reach for your phone. Not because you decided to, but because the environment signaled it. You feel stressed and instantly look for distraction. Not because you planned it, but because the emotion triggered it. You sit down to work and suddenly feel the urge to avoid it. Not because you lack discipline, but because the cue has been reinforced over time. This is how powerful cues are. They bypass conscious thought. They activate behavior instantly. And once the loop begins, it runs to completion. This is why awareness must shift. You are not just observing your actions. You are identifying what precedes them. Because if you can control the cue, you can influence the entire loop. Now there are two primary types of cues. External cues and internal cues. External cues come from your environment. Your phone lights up. A notification sound. A specific place where you usually perform a behavior. Objects that are associated with routines. These cues are visible. They are easier to identify. But they are also powerful because they are constant. They surround you every day. And if your environment is filled with triggers that lead to unproductive behavior, those behaviors will repeat automatically. This is why environment design is critical. Because your surroundings are not neutral. They are influencing your actions at all times. Now consider internal cues. These are more subtle. They come from within. Emotions. Thoughts. Physical sensations. Stress can trigger distraction. Boredom can trigger stimulation-seeking behavior. Fatigue can trigger avoidance. These cues are harder to control because they are part of your internal experience. But they follow patterns. And patterns can be recognized. Once you begin to observe them, you start to see connections. You notice that certain emotions lead to specific actions. You notice that certain times of day bring predictable behaviors. You begin to map the loop. This is where control begins. Because once the cue is identified, the behavior is no longer random. It becomes predictable. And what is predictable can be changed. Now here is a critical truth. You cannot eliminate cues completely. They are part of how the brain functions. But you can control how you respond to them. And in some cases, you can redesign them. This is where most people make mistakes. They try to rely on willpower at the moment of action. They wait until the habit is already in motion. And then they try to stop it. But at that point, the system is already running. The cue has activated the response. The loop is moving forward. And interrupting it becomes difficult. Instead, control must happen earlier. At the level of the cue. If you remove or reduce the cue, the behavior becomes less likely to occur. If you replace the cue, you can redirect the behavior entirely. This is strategic control, not reactive control. Now consider this example. If your phone is always within reach, it becomes a constant cue. You do not need to think about using it. The presence alone is enough to trigger the behavior. But if the phone is removed from your immediate environment, the cue weakens. The behavior becomes less automatic. This is not about discipline. It is about design. The same principle applies to internal cues. You may not be able to remove stress or boredom. But you can change how you respond to them. Instead of reacting with distraction, you can create alternative responses. Structured responses. Intentional responses. This is how you begin to reshape the loop. Now there is another layer to this system. Anticipation. Over time, the brain begins to associate the cue with the expected reward. So the moment the cue appears, your brain anticipates the outcome. It expects relief. It expects pleasure. It expects comfort. And this anticipation strengthens the urge to act. This is why cues feel powerful. They do not just trigger behavior. They trigger expectations. And expectation drives action. To change this, you must interrupt the association. You must weaken the connection between cue and reward. Or you must create a new connection. One that leads to a different outcome. This is how habits are redirected. Not by force, but by restructuring the loop. Now imagine what happens when you become fully aware of your cues. You begin to see patterns everywhere. You recognize triggers before they take control. You notice how your environment influences your behavior. You understand how your emotions guide your actions. And in that awareness, you gain something powerful. A moment. A brief space between cue and response. And in that space, you have a choice. You can follow the old pattern. Or you can create a new one. At first, that space will be small. Almost unnoticeable. But with practice, it expands. And as it expands, your control increases. This is the beginning of mastery. Not over your life, but over your responses. Because your responses shape your habits. And your habits shape your life. So if you want to take control, you must start here. Not with the action, but with the cue. Because the moment you control the beginning of the loop, you influence everything that follows. Chapter 5 Summary. Every habit begins with a cue, a signal that triggers behavior. Cues can be external, coming from the environment, or internal, coming from emotions and thoughts. Most people fail to change habits because they focus on actions instead of identifying triggers. Control is gained by recognizing cues, redesigning environments, and creating intentional responses. 5 lessons to practice. Identify one habit you want to change. Trace it back to its cue. Observe both external and internal triggers. Pay attention to time, location, and emotional state. Remove or reduce cues that lead to negative behavior. Adjust your environment to support better habits. Create a replacement response for a common trigger. Decide in advance how you will act. Practice noticing the moment before action. Use that awareness to interrupt the loop. Transition to Chapter 6. You now understand where habits begin. You see how cues trigger behavior. How the loop is activated. How patterns form through repetition. But there is something even more powerful at work. Because repetition alone is not the full story. What truly shapes your life is how those repetitions accumulate over time. Small actions do not stay small. They compound. They grow. They multiply. They become outcomes you cannot ignore. Now we move to Chapter 6. The Repetition Engine. Chapter 6, The Repetition Engine. Nothing in your life changes instantly. Not your body. Not your mind. Not your habits. Not your identity. Everything changes through repetition. This is the quiet mechanism behind every transformation you have ever experienced. And it is also the reason most people never change at all. Because repetition does not feel powerful while it is happening. It feels insignificant. It feels slow. It feels like nothing is moving. But repetition is not designed to feel powerful in the moment. It is designed to accumulate. And accumulation is where real change happens. This is the repetition engine. A system that converts small, repeated actions into large, irreversible outcomes over time. Most people underestimate this engine because they evaluate their progress daily. They look for immediate results. They expect visible change. They want proof that something is happening now. But the repetition engine does not operate on short time frames. It operates on compounding time. Each action you repeat is not isolated. It is added to the previous one. And together, they form direction. Not through intensity, but through consistency. This is why small habits matter more than big efforts. A single intense effort creates a spike, but repetition creates a trajectory. And trajectory determines your future. Think about your current life. It is not the result of one decision. It is the result of thousands of repeated ones. The way you spend your mornings. The way you handle stress. The way you respond to discomfort. The way you use your attention. Each of these behaviors, repeated over time, becomes structured. And structure becomes the outcome. This is how the repetition engine builds your life without permission. Not by asking what you want, but by recording what you do, and then multiplying it. Now here is what most people fail to understand. Repetition does not just reinforce behavior. It amplifies it. Every repeated action strengthens the neural pathway associated with it. The more you repeat something, the easier it becomes. And the easier it becomes, the more likely you are to repeat it again. This creates a loop of increasing efficiency. But efficiency is neutral. It does not distinguish between good and bad habits. It simply strengthens what is practiced. So if you repeat distraction, you become more efficient at being distracted. If you repeat focus, you become more efficient at focusing. The engine does not care about direction. It only cares about repetition. And this is where most lives are shaped without awareness. Because repetition feels harmless in isolation. One skipped task. One moment of distraction. One avoided responsibility. These do not feel significant. But the engine does not process them individually. It processes them cumulatively. And over time, the accumulation becomes visible in your life. This is why people often wake up and feel like their life changed suddenly. But nothing changed suddenly. The repetition engine was always running. It was just invisible in real time. Now consider this carefully. Repetition does not only build skills. It builds identity reinforcement. Every repeated action sends a signal to your brain. This is who you are. And the more the signal is repeated, the stronger the belief becomes. So repetition does not just create ability. It creates identity certainty. You stop questioning whether you are disciplined or undisciplined. You start believing it as fact. Because the evidence has been repeated enough times to feel undeniable. This is why breaking habits feels like breaking identity. Because you are not just stopping an action. You are interrupting repetition that has become self-definition. And the brain resists that. Not because it is stubborn, but because it values consistency above change. Now there is another layer to the repetition engine. Time delay. The results of repetition are not immediate. There is always a gap between action and outcome. This delay is what makes the system difficult to understand. Because you cannot see the connection in real time. You repeat an action today. But the result appears later. Sometimes much later. So the brain assumes there is no connection. This is a critical illusion. Because absence of immediate feedback feels like absence of impact. But the engine does not rely on immediate feedback. It relies on accumulated feedback. And accumulated feedback is only visible over time. This is why most people underestimate both good and bad habits. Good habits feel ineffective at first. Bad habits feel harmless at first. But both are being processed by the same system. And both are compounding in the background. Now imagine two people using the repetition engine differently. One repeats small disciplined actions every day. Another repeats small distracted actions every day. On a single day, there is no visible difference. In a week, still minimal difference. In a month, a subtle difference appears. In a year, the difference becomes clear. Over multiple years, the difference becomes life-defining. Not because of one major decision, but because of accumulated repetition. This is why discipline is not a single act. It is a repeated pattern. And consistency is not motivation. It is an accumulation. Now here is the most important realization in this chapter. You are already using the repetition engine. Every day. Whether you are aware of it or not. The only question is what you are feeding it. Because it will amplify whatever you give it. If you give it focus, it will build focus. If you give it distraction, it will build distraction. If you give it discipline, it will build discipline. If you give it avoidance, it will build avoidance. There is no neutral input. Everything repeats into something larger. This is why control is not about single actions. It is about repeated direction. Now there is a practical shift that changes everything. Instead of asking what should I do today, you begin asking what am I repeating every day? Because repetition defines trajectory. And trajectory defines outcome. Small improvements, repeated consistently, create exponential change. Not because each action is powerful, but because repetition compounds power over time. This is the engine most people ignore. Because it does not demand attention. It does not feel urgent. It does not produce instant feedback. But it quietly builds everything you will become. So if you want to change your life, you do not start with big actions. You start with repeated ones. Because what you repeat becomes what you become. Chapter 6 Summary. Repetition is the core mechanism that transforms small actions into long-term outcomes through compounding effects. The repetition engine strengthens whatever behaviors are consistently practiced, regardless of whether they are positive or negative. Because results are delayed, most people underestimate the impact of their daily actions. Over time, repeated behavior shapes both skill and identity, making consistency the most powerful force of change. Lessons to practice. Identify one behavior you repeat daily without thinking. Evaluate its long-term direction. Replace one low-value repeated action with a high-value one. Focus on consistency, not intensity. Track repetition instead of outcomes. Pay attention to what you do daily, not just results. Understand that small actions accumulate over time. Trust the process of compounding. Commit to one habit for long enough to see repetition effects. Do not judge progress too early. Transition to Chapter 7. You now understand how repetition builds everything. You see how small actions accumulate. How consistency creates outcomes. How identity is shaped over time. But there is another force influencing this system. One that surrounds you constantly. One that silently shapes what you repeat before you even decide. Your environment. Now we move to Chapter 7. The Environment Blueprint. Chapter 7. The Environment Blueprint. There is a mistake most people make when trying to change their life. They focus on willpower. They focus on discipline. They focus on motivation. They try to change what is happening inside them. But they ignore what is shaping them from the outside. Your environment. Because before you make any decision, your environment has already influenced it. Before you act, your surroundings have already nudged you. Before you think, your context has already narrowed your options. This is the environment blueprint. A silent system that designs your behavior before you are even aware of it. Most people believe they are choosing freely. But they are often responding to design. The design of their space. The design of their inputs. The design of what surrounds them every day. Your environment is not just where you live. It is what you repeatedly see. What you repeatedly hear. What you repeatedly interact with. And over time, these exposures shape your habits more than intention ever will. Because behavior is not created in isolation. It is triggered in context. Now consider this carefully. If you place a behavior in the right environment, it becomes easier. If you place it in the wrong environment, it becomes harder. This is why discipline often fails in hostile environments. Not because people are weak, but because the system is stronger than the individual. Your environment either supports your habits or sabotages them. There is no neutral space. Even silence is a design. Even clutter is a signal. Even convenience is an influence. Every object around you is either increasing friction or reducing it. And friction determines behavior. If something is easy, you will do it more often. If something is difficult, you will avoid it more often. This is not a moral issue. It is mechanical. Your brain is constantly seeking the path of least resistance. So it follows the easiest available option. And that option is almost always defined by the environment. Think about your daily routine. Where do you spend most of your time? What do you see first when you wake up? What is within reach when you are bored? What is available when you are tired? These details are not small. They are behavioral architecture. They determine what becomes automatic. Because habits do not only depend on cues and repetition. They depend on accessibility. What is available becomes what is used. What is visible becomes what is chosen. What is easy becomes what is repeated. This is why the environment is often more powerful than intention. You may intend to focus. But if distractions are always visible, attention will drift. You may intend to be productive. But if your workspace is disorganized, your mind will follow the same pattern. You may intend to improve. But if your environment reinforces old behaviors, change will struggle to survive. Now here is a critical realization. You are already being shaped by your environment whether you design it or not. If you do not control it, it controls you by default. This is why many people feel stuck without understanding why. They are trying to change internally while living in an external system that reinforces the opposite direction. This creates friction. And friction drains willpower. Eventually, the system wins. Not because change is impossible, but because the environment is stronger than isolated effort. Now there are two types of environmental influence: passive influence and active influence. Passive influence is what surrounds you without effort. The things you see daily. The sounds you hear regularly. The spaces you occupy without thinking. These influences shape your baseline behavior. They define what feels normal. Active influence is what you intentionally engage with. The content you consume. The people you interact with. The systems you choose to participate in. These influences shape your direction. Most people underestimate passive influence. But it is often stronger than active influence because it is constant. You cannot escape it without awareness. It is always present. And repetition makes it more powerful over time. If your environment repeatedly exposes you to distraction, distraction becomes normal. If your environment repeatedly exposes you to focus, focus becomes normal. This is how environments program behavior without instruction. Now consider this principle. Your environment does not just support habits. It creates probability. It makes certain behaviors more likely and others less likely. So when you think about change, you are not just changing yourself. You are changing probabilities. You are designing which actions are more likely to occur. This is a crucial shift in thinking. Instead of asking how do I force myself to act differently, you begin asking how do I make the right action easier than the wrong one. Because behavior follows ease, not intention. If studying is easier than scrolling, you will study more. If exercising is easier than staying still, you will move more. If focus is easier than distraction, you will concentrate more. This is environmental leverage. Now there is another layer to this system. Identity reinforcement through the environment. Your environment does not only trigger behavior. It reinforces identity. If your surroundings reflect discipline, you begin to see yourself as disciplined. If your surroundings reflect chaos, you begin to feel chaotic. Because your brain interprets the environment as evidence. Evidence of who you are. This is why environment change often leads to identity change faster than motivation. Because it surrounds you with proof of a different version of yourself. Now here is the practical truth. You cannot rely on internal strength alone to change your life. Because internal strength is inconsistent. But the environment is consistent. So the most effective change strategy is not self-control. It is environmental control. You do not just change behavior. You design conditions where the desired behavior becomes inevitable. This is the environment blueprint. Not forcing change, but designing it. Now here is the final realization of this chapter. If your environment stays the same, your habits will stay the same. If your habits stay the same, your identity will stay the same. And if your identity stays the same, your life will stay the same. So if you want a different life, you must first change the system around you. Because your environment is not just where you live. It is what you become. Chapter 7 Summary. Your environment is a powerful system that shapes behavior through exposure, accessibility, and repetition. It influences habits more consistently than willpower because it operates continuously in the background. Changing the environment is often more effective than trying to force internal discipline. Designing surroundings to support desired behaviors increases the probability of success and reinforces identity. Lessons to practice. Identify one area of your environment that encourages distraction. Reduce or remove it. Make one positive habit easier to start by adjusting your space. Lower friction wherever possible. Place useful behaviors in visible and accessible locations. Increase exposure to positive cues. Observe how your environment affects your mood and focus. Track patterns without judgment. Begin designing your surroundings intentionally. Treat your environment as a system, not background. Transition to Chapter 8. You now see how powerful your environment is. How it shapes behavior. How it reinforces identity. How it silently influences your decisions. But this leads to a deeper misconception most people hold. They believe the solution is discipline. They believe success is about forcing themselves harder. But what if discipline itself is misunderstood? What if motivation is not the answer? What if the entire idea of willpower is incomplete? Now we move to Chapter 8. The Discipline Myth. Chapter 8. The Discipline Myth. There is a belief that has shaped how most people try to change their lives. If I just had more discipline, I would succeed. If I were more consistent, I would reach my goals. If I could stay motivated, everything would fall into place. This belief feels logical. It feels responsible. It feels empowering. But it is also misleading. Because it places the burden of change entirely on willpower. And willpower is one of the most unreliable systems in human behavior. This is the discipline myth. The idea that success is primarily a result of self-control in the moment. That people succeed because they are stronger. And fail because they are weaker. But reality does not work that way. Because discipline is not a constant resource. It fluctuates. It depletes. It depends on the conditions. Some days it is strong. Other days it is weak. And when life becomes difficult, discipline is usually the first thing to break. Now consider what this means. If your entire system depends on something that is unstable, then your results will also be unstable. This is why motivation-based change rarely lasts. Because motivation is emotional energy. And emotional energy is temporary. It rises quickly. And disappears just as quickly. So when people rely on discipline and motivation, they are relying on internal states that are not designed to be consistent. And yet they expect consistent outcomes. This is the contradiction at the core of most failed change attempts. People try to use willpower to override systems that are far more powerful than willpower itself. Because habits are not built on discipline. They are built on repetition. Environment. Identity. Cues. Systems that operate continuously, even when motivation is absent. This is why disciplined people are often misunderstood. They are not necessarily stronger at every moment. They are often simply supported by better systems. They reduce friction. They design environments. They build routines that remove the need for constant decision-making. What looks like discipline from the outside is often structured on the inside. Now here is a critical insight. If you need discipline to perform an action, the system is not optimized. Because optimal systems do not require constant force. They require design. Think about your daily life. How many decisions require you to push yourself? How many actions depend on how you feel at the moment? How often do you rely on motivation to begin something important? Each of these moments is a point of friction. And friction drains discipline. So the more friction exists in your system, the more discipline you need. But discipline is not infinite. Which means the system eventually fails. Now consider the alternative. A system where the right action is the easiest action. Where habits run automatically. Where the environment supports behavior. Where identity aligns with action. In that system, discipline becomes unnecessary for most behaviors. Not because you lack discipline, but because you no longer depend on it. This is the shift most people never make. They try to become more disciplined instead of becoming less dependent on discipline. But the goal is not to increase willpower. The goal is to reduce the need for it. Now there is another layer to the discipline myth. It creates self-judgment. When people fail to act, they assume it is a personal flaw. They think they are lazy. They think they are weak. They think they lack character. But in most cases, the issue is not character. It is system design. Because behavior is not just a reflection of effort. It is a reflection of structure. If the structure supports the behavior, it happens. If it does not, it fails. This is why even highly motivated people struggle in poorly designed environments. And why moderately motivated people succeed in well-designed systems. The system often matters more than the individual moment of effort. Now here is the dangerous part of the discipline myth. It encourages short bursts of change followed by collapse. People push hard for a few days. They rely on intensity. They force themselves to act differently. But without system support, the structure collapses under pressure. And when it collapses, people assume they failed. So they try again. Another burst. Another cycle. Another collapse. This creates frustration. But the real issue is not effort. It is sustainability. Now consider what sustainable change actually looks like. It does not depend on how you feel. It does not require constant effort. It does not demand daily motivation. It is built into the system itself. Through repetition. Through the environment. Through identity alignment. This is why systems always outperform discipline over time. Because systems do not rely on emotional stability. They operate regardless of it. Now here is a key realization. Discipline is still useful. But not as a primary tool. It is a bridge tool. It is used to build systems. Not to replace them. You use discipline to create structure. And then structure replaces the need for discipline. This is the correct hierarchy. Not discipline first. But system first. Now let's reframe what discipline actually is. Discipline is the ability to act in alignment with a system before it becomes automatic. It is a temporary force used to install long-term behavior. But once the behavior is installed, discipline steps back. Because the system takes over. This is how lasting change is created. Not through constant effort. But through intelligent effort at the beginning. Followed by repetition that removes effort over time. Now here is the final truth of this chapter. If your life requires constant discipline to maintain, your system is unstable. But if your life runs mostly on automation aligned with your goals, discipline becomes optional. Not because you are more disciplined, but because you are better designed. This is the end of the discipline myth. Not the end of discipline itself, but the end of dependence on it. Chapter 8 Summary. Discipline is not a reliable foundation for long-term change because it is inconsistent and emotionally dependent. Most failures attributed to lack of discipline are actually failures of system design. Effective behavior change comes from reducing reliance on discipline through better systems, environment design, and habit automation. Lessons to practice. Identify one area where you rely heavily on discipline. Analyze what makes it difficult to maintain. Reduce friction for one important behavior. Make the right action easier to start. Build one small system that removes decision-making. Focus on structure over effort. Observe when motivation controls your behavior. Replace motivation dependence with routine. Use discipline only to create systems, not sustain them. Shift from effort-based thinking to design-based thinking. Transition to Chapter 9. You now understand why discipline alone fails. Why motivation is unstable. Why willpower is limited. Why systems outperform effort. But this creates an important question. If your habits are already formed, how do you change them? If systems are already running, how do you rewrite them? If identity is already established, how do you transform it? Now we move to Chapter 9. Rewriting the Code. Chapter 9. Rewriting the Code. Every habit you have today was once something you learned. It was not permanent when it began. It was not fixed when it started. It was simply a repeated action that became stable over time. This is important to understand. Because anything that was learned can also be unlearned. And anything that was built can also be rebuilt. This is the foundation of rewriting the code. The habit code is not permanent architecture. It is a programmable structure. And anything that is programmable can be changed. But change does not happen by erasing habits. It happens by replacing them. This is where most people fail. They try to remove behavior without replacing the system that produces it. But habits are not isolated actions. They are loops. And loops cannot be deleted through force. They must be redirected. To rewrite the code, you must first understand what you are actually working with. Every habit is supported by three elements working together: a trigger, a behavior, a reward. We have seen this before. But now the focus is different. Because rewriting is not about awareness alone. It is about substitution. The trigger remains. The system stays active. But the response changes. This is the core principle of behavioral rewriting. You do not eliminate the cue. You redesign the response. Now consider why this matters. If you attempt to remove a habit completely, you create a vacuum in the system. And the brain does not tolerate empty patterns. It seeks replacement automatically. So if you remove a behavior without replacing it, the old one returns. This is why relapse happens. Not because of weakness, but because of structural gaps. The system still has a trigger. The system still expects a reward. But the response is missing. So it restores the original loop. This is why rewriting is essential. Not removal. Replacement. Now here is how rewriting actually works. First, you identify the cue. The moment that initiates the behavior. This is the entry point of the loop. Without understanding the cue, nothing can be changed effectively. Next, you identify the reward. What the brain is actually seeking from the behavior. Because every habit exists for a reason. It may be comforting. It may be a relief. It may be stimulating. It may be to avoid discomfort. The reward is the real driver, not the action itself. Then comes the critical step. You keep the cue. You keep the reward. But you change the behavior. This is where transformation happens. Because the brain is not trying to preserve the action. It is trying to preserve the reward. So if you can provide the same reward through a different behavior, the system adapts. And the old habit weakens. This is rewriting the code in practice. Now consider a real pattern. A person feels stress. The cue is emotional tension. The behavior is scrolling on a phone. The reward is relief and distraction. To rewrite this, you do not fight the stress directly. And you do not simply remove the phone. You replace the behavior. Stress still appears. But instead of scrolling, the response becomes something else that also creates relief. A walk. A breathing pattern. A structured pause. The reward is preserved. But the behavior is upgraded. This is why replacement works where force fails. Because it respects the underlying system. Now here is another important principle. You cannot rewrite everything at once. The brain does not restructure globally under pressure. It adapts locally through repetition. This means change must be targeted. One loop at a time. One habit at a time. One system at a time. Each successful rewrite builds evidence that change is possible. And that evidence strengthens future rewrites. Now there is a deeper layer to this process. Timing. The most effective moment to rewrite a habit is immediately after the cue appears. Not before. Not long after. But in the moment of activation. Because that is where the system is most flexible. Before automation fully takes over. This is the point of intervention. And at first, it feels difficult. Because you are interrupting something that was previously automatic. But with repetition, interruption becomes the new pattern. And eventually, the new pattern becomes automatic. This is how rewriting stabilizes. Now here is a critical realization. You are always rewriting your code. Even when you are not trying to. Every repeated behavior is reinforcing something. So the question is not whether your code is being rewritten. The question is whether you are directing it. Or letting it run by default. Because default rewriting is slow, unconscious, and often misaligned. But intentional rewriting is structured, deliberate, and directional. Now consider what happens when rewriting is applied consistently. Old patterns weaken. New patterns strengthen. Identity begins to shift. Because identity is not changed directly. It is rewritten through behavior. And behavior is rewritten through loops. This is why rewriting the code is not a single action. It is a process of gradual replacement. A systematic redesign of how triggers connect to responses. Now here is the final truth of this chapter. You are not stuck with your current habits. You are maintaining them through repetition. And anything that is maintained can be modified. Not instantly, but deliberately. Not through force, but through design. This is how the code is rewritten. Not by breaking yourself, but by rebuilding your system one loop at a time. Chapter 9 Summary. Habits cannot be removed directly, they must be replaced by new behaviors that preserve the original reward. Every habit follows a loop of cue, behavior, and reward, and change occurs by modifying the behavior while keeping the loop structure intact. Sustainable change happens through targeted, repeated rewrites of individual habit loops over time. Lessons to practice. Identify one habit loop currently active in your life. Break it into cue, behavior, and reward. Do not focus on removing the habit. Focus on replacing the behavior. Design a new response that satisfies the same reward. Test it in real situations. Practice responding differently immediately after the cue appears. Train interruption into a new automatic pattern. Work on one habit at a time. Prioritize consistency over volume of change. Transition to Chapter 10. You now understand how habits can be rewritten. How loops can be redirected. How rewards can be preserved while behaviors change. How systems adapt through replacement, not removal. But there is still a deeper principle that determines how fast transformation actually happens. Because not all changes are equal in impact. Some changes are small but slow. Others are small but powerful. And when repeated, they create exponential results. Now we move to Chapter 10. The 1% Shift Principle. Chapter 10, The 1% Shift Principle. Most people misunderstand transformation. They believe change must be dramatic to be meaningful. A complete reinvention. A sudden breakthrough. A radical shift in behavior. But this belief creates a problem. Because it sets expectations that are impossible to sustain. And when those expectations fail, people assume they have failed. But real transformation does not happen in dramatic moments. It happens in small shifts. Almost invisible at first. This is the 1% shift principle. The idea that small improvements, repeated consistently, create exponential outcomes over time. Not because each improvement is powerful on its own, but because they compound. Now consider this carefully. A 1% improvement may feel insignificant at the moment. You will not notice immediate change. You will not feel different. You will not see dramatic results. But repetition changes the impact entirely. Because each 1% shift builds on the previous one. And over time, these small adjustments accumulate into a completely different trajectory. This is how habits quietly reshape your life. Not through intensity, but through accumulation. Most people ignore small improvements because they do not produce instant feedback. But the brain is not designed to measure transformation in short intervals. It is designed to adapt over time. And adaptation is where compounding begins. Think about your daily behavior. If you improve one habit slightly each day, the difference is not noticeable immediately. But if that improvement continues for weeks, months, and years, the outcome becomes significant. Not because of a single change, but because of continuous alignment. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity creates spikes. But consistency creates direction. And direction determines where your life ends up. Now here is the deeper truth behind the 1% shift principle. Negative habits also compound. Just as small improvements accumulate positively, small declines accumulate negatively. A slight delay each day. A small distraction repeated often. A minor avoidance of responsibility. Each of these seems harmless in isolation. But they all follow the same compounding logic. And over time, they produce noticeable decline. This is why the difference between success and failure is rarely a single decision. It is the accumulation of small ones. Now consider what this means for control. If your life is shaped by small repeated actions, then control is not about major interventions. It is about micro-adjustments, tiny corrections, small improvements, subtle shifts in behavior. This is the true power of the 1% principle. It removes pressure, because you no longer need massive change to make progress. You only need directionally correct change repeated consistently. Now there is another layer to this principle: momentum. Once small improvements begin to accumulate, they start to reinforce each other. One positive habit makes another easier. One improvement increases confidence in the next. One success reduces resistance to future change. This creates a feedback loop. And that feedback loop accelerates transformation. Not instantly, but gradually and then suddenly. This is why progress often feels slow at first, then faster later. Because compounding requires time to build visible impact. Now here is a critical realization. Most people underestimate what they can achieve in a year. But they also underestimate what repetition can destroy at the same time. Because the 1% shift principle works in both directions, upward and downward. Positive habits compound into growth. Negative habits compound into decline. And both operate silently. Now consider how this applies to identity. Every small action you repeat is reinforcing who you are becoming. Not in dramatic ways, but in consistent signals to your brain. This is who you are. So when you improve slightly, you are not just improving behavior. You are updating identity. And when identity shifts, behavior follows more easily. This is why small changes often feel easier to maintain than large ones. Because they do not threaten identity stability. They integrate gradually. Now there is a common mistake people make when applying this principle. They underestimate patience. They expect visible results too early. And when results do not appear quickly, they stop. But compounding does not reward impatience. It rewards consistency over time. Now imagine two people starting from the same point. One tries to change everything at once. The other improves by 1% every day. At first, the difference is invisible. But over time, the gap widens. And eventually, it becomes undeniable. Not because one worked harder in a single moment, but because one stayed consistent longer. This is the hidden advantage of small improvements. They are sustainable. And sustainability creates long-term advantage. Now here is the final truth of this chapter. You do not need to transform your entire life today. You only need to improve it slightly. And repeat that improvement consistently enough for it to compound. Because over time, small improvements do not stay small. They accumulate into identity. And identity accumulates into life. Chapter 10 Summary. Small improvements repeated consistently create exponential results through compounding. Both positive and negative habits follow this principle, meaning tiny actions shape long-term outcomes significantly. Sustainable change is achieved through gradual, consistent adjustments rather than large, unsustainable transformations. Lessons to practice. Identify one area of your life for small improvement. Focus only on a 1% change, not a major overhaul. Repeat the improvement daily without interruption. Prioritize consistency over intensity. Track progress over weeks, not days. Allow compounding time to work. Avoid resetting habits after small failures. Focus on continuation, not perfection. Recognize that small actions accumulate into identity. Stay patient with the process of growth. Transition to Chapter 11. You now understand how small changes compound over time. How repetition creates exponential outcomes. How identity is shaped gradually through micro-actions. How direction matters more than intensity. But this leads to a deeper level of control. Because once you understand how habits build your life, you can stop reacting to your life entirely. And start designing it. Now we move to Chapter 11. Becoming an Architect. Chapter 11. Becoming the Architect. Most people live inside their habits without ever questioning who built them. They wake up inside routines they did not consciously design. They move through patterns they did not intentionally choose. They repeat behaviors that were shaped over time without awareness. And because these systems run automatically, life begins to feel fixed. As if it is something that happens to them, not something they are creating. This is the shift that separates reaction from authorship. Because at a certain point, understanding habits is no longer enough. You must begin to design them. This is where you stop being the product of the habit code and become the architect of it. Now consider what that actually means. An architect does not guess. An architect does not react. An architect does not build randomly. An architect designs systems before they exist. They decide the structure before execution. They define function before behavior. They create conditions that produce predictable outcomes. This is how your life works when you take control of habits at a structural level. You stop asking, what am I doing today? And start asking, what system am I building that will run automatically tomorrow? Because every habit is part of a larger system. And every system produces consistent outcomes over time. Now here is the critical realization. Most people try to improve their life by adjusting individual behaviors. But architects think in systems. A system is not a single habit. It is a collection of habits working together toward a direction. Morning routines, work patterns, decision structures, environmental design, emotional responses. All of these combine into a behavioral system. And that system produces your life without needing daily input. This is why becoming an architect is not about doing more. It is about designing better. Now consider your current life. It is already a system. Even if you never designed it consciously. Your habits have created structure. Your environment has reinforced patterns. Your repetition has formed an identity. So the question is not whether you have a system. The question is whether you designed it intentionally. Or inherited it unconsciously. Most people inherit their systems. From the environment. From upbringing. From repetition without awareness. And then they try to improve outcomes without changing the system itself. But systems determine outcomes, not intentions. This is why architects focus on leverage points. Small structural changes that produce large behavioral shifts. A single environmental adjustment. A single routine change. A single trigger redesign. These changes can alter entire behavior chains. Because systems are interconnected. Now here is a key principle of architecture. You do not control every action directly. You control the conditions that produce actions. This removes the need for constant decision-making. Because the system carries the behavior forward. If you design correctly, discipline becomes unnecessary in most situations. Not because effort is eliminated, but because effort is embedded into structure. Now there is another level to this idea. Architects do not focus on motivation. They focus on inevitability. They ask one question repeatedly. If nothing changes emotionally, will the system still produce the desired outcome? If the answer is no, the system is weak. If the answer is yes, the system is strong. This is how stability is built. Not through emotional consistency, but through structural consistency. Now consider how this applies to habits. A habit is not just something you do. It is something your system produces. So if you want to change a habit, you must change the system that produces it. Not just the behavior itself. This is where most people fail. They try to modify output without modifying input conditions. But architecture starts at the input level. Triggers. Environment. Identity signals. Reinforcement loops. These are the building blocks. Now here is the transition point. Once you begin thinking like an architect, your perspective changes. You stop blaming inconsistency. You stop relying on motivation. You stop treating failure as personal weakness. Instead, you start analyzing structure. You begin asking, where did the system allow this outcome to happen? What condition produced this behavior? What loop reinforced it? This removes emotional judgment and replaces it with design thinking. And design thinking creates control. Now here is the deeper truth. You are already an architect. Whether you realize it or not. Because your current life is already the result of a system you have been building through repetition. The only question is whether that system is intentional or accidental. And once you see this clearly, responsibility shifts. Not in a negative way, but in a powerful way. Because if the system exists, it can be redesigned. And if it can be redesigned, your future is not fixed. It is editable. Now consider what changes when you fully adopt this mindset. You stop trying to force change in the moment, and start designing change in advance. You prepare environments that guide behavior. You set triggers that support intention. You reduce friction for important actions. You increase friction for destructive ones. You stop reacting to life, and start structuring it. This is the role of the architect. Not to control every moment, but to design a system where the right moments happen naturally. Now here is the final truth of this chapter. You are always building a system. The only question is whether it is building the life you want, or the life you accidentally created. And once you accept this, everything changes. Because you are no longer trapped inside habits. You are designing them. Chapter 11 Summary. Becoming an architect means shifting from reacting to behaviors to designing systems that produce them. Life is already a system shaped by habits, environment, and repetition, whether intentionally designed or not. True control comes from structuring conditions that make desired behaviors inevitable rather than relying on motivation or willpower. Lessons to practice. Identify one system in your life that runs automatically. Analyze how it produces your current behavior. Focus on redesigning conditions, not just actions. Change inputs, not only outputs. Reduce reliance on motivation by improving structure. Build systems that function independently of mood. Think in terms of long-term behavior production. Ask what your system will create over time. Begin designing one area of your life intentionally. Treat it as an architectural project, not a daily struggle. Transition to Chapter 12. You now understand how systems shape behavior. How habits are produced by structure. How identity is reinforced through design. How life becomes the output of repeated systems. But there is one final realization left. Because every system you build today does not stay in the present. It continues forward. It compounds into your future automatically, whether you guide it or not. Now we move to Chapter 12. The automatic future. Chapter 12. The automatic future. Most people think the future arrives. They imagine it as something that happens later. Something separate from today. Something unpredictable and open-ended. But the future is not separate from the present. It is an extension of it. A continuation of everything you are already doing. Every habit you repeat today is already moving forward. Every pattern you maintain is already projecting itself into tomorrow. Every system you run is already building what comes next. This is the automatic future. A future that is not created in a single moment, but constructed through repetition over time. And because it is built automatically, most people do not notice it forming. They assume change will happen later. They assume decisions will become clearer in the future. They assume things will somehow improve on their own. But systems do not pause. They continue. They expand. They reinforce themselves. Every action you take is a forward-moving signal. Not just for today, but for what today becomes tomorrow. Now consider this carefully. If your current habits continue without interruption, your future is already being written. Not in a fixed way, but in a probabilistic way. Your current patterns are increasing the likelihood of certain outcomes, and decreasing the likelihood of others. This is how the future forms. Not through sudden shifts, but through directional consistency. Now here is the critical realization. Most people believe they will change in the future. They assume that at some point, motivation will increase. Discipline will improve. Circumstances will align. But this assumption ignores how systems actually behave. Systems do not improve automatically. They continue until interrupted. So if nothing changes, the system continues exactly as it is. And if it continues, the outcomes also continue. This is why the future often feels predictable in hindsight. Because it was being built all along. Through repetition. Through the environment. Through identity reinforcement. Now consider your daily life. What you repeat when no one is watching. How you respond when you are tired. What you choose when you have no pressure. These moments are not neutral. They are directional inputs into your future. Each one adjusts the trajectory slightly. Not dramatically, but consistently. And consistency over time becomes an outcome. Now here is where control becomes real. You cannot change the past system instantly, but you can change the direction of the current one. And direction is everything. Because even a small shift in direction, if maintained long enough, leads to a completely different destination. This is the power of compounding behavior. Now imagine two versions of a person starting today. Both have the same past. Both have the same starting point. But one begins to adjust habits slightly. One begins to improve systems gradually. One begins to align actions with intention. The other continues without change. At first, there is no visible difference. But over time, the gap begins to form. And eventually, it becomes irreversible. Not because one moment defined everything, but because one direction was maintained consistently. This is how futures diverge. Not through sudden change, but through repeated decisions that compound over time. Now there is a deeper layer to this. Most people think they are waiting for the right time to change. But time is not the deciding factor. System direction is. Because even with more time, an unchanged system produces the same results. More time does not create change. It amplifies existing patterns. So if the pattern is strong, time strengthens it. If the pattern is weak, time weakens it. But it always reinforces what already exists. Now here is the most important truth of this chapter. Your future is not something you enter. It is something you are building right now. Through repetition. Through habits. Through systems that are already active. And because of that, your future is not unknown. It is already in motion. But it is still editable. Because direction can be changed at any point. Not by rewriting the past, but by adjusting the present system. Now consider what happens when awareness reaches this level. You stop thinking in terms of motivation. You stop waiting for clarity. You stop expecting external change. Instead, you begin to focus on system correction. You ask, what is this behavior producing long term? You ask, what direction is this habit reinforcing? You ask, what future am I currently building without realizing it? This is the shift from passive living to active design. Now here is the final realization. There is no separate future version of you waiting at a destination. There is only the continuation of your current system. Either improved or unchanged. And every day, you are choosing which one becomes real. Through repetition. Through the environment. Through identity. Through small actions that accumulate into outcomes. Now the responsibility becomes clear. Not as pressure, but as awareness. Because once you see the automatic nature of the future, you can no longer ignore it. You begin to design it consciously. You begin to adjust direction intentionally. You begin to treat every habit as a future-building action. And in doing so, you stop reacting to life and start constructing it. Chapter 12 Summary. The future is not a separate event but a continuation of current habits and systems. Every repeated action contributes to long-term direction and shapes outcomes over time. Without intervention, existing systems continue automatically, reinforcing current trajectories. Changing the future requires adjusting present systems, not waiting for external change. Lessons to practice. Identify one current habit that strongly influences your future direction. Evaluate its long-term trajectory. Adjust one behavior that shapes your daily system. Focus on direction, not perfection. Observe how small actions accumulate over time. Think in long-term patterns, not short-term results. Stop waiting for future motivation. Act on system design today. Treat every repeated action as a future-building input. Become conscious of long-term consequences. Final transition. You began this journey believing habits were small behaviors. Simple actions. Daily routines. Minor choices. But now you understand they are something far more powerful. They are systems. Systems that operate beneath awareness. Systems that shape identity. Systems that build the future automatically. You have seen how habits form through cues, actions, and rewards. How they become automatic through repetition. How the environment shapes behavior before intention. How identity is reinforced through repeated action. How discipline is replaced by systems. How small changes compound into transformation. And ultimately, how your future is already being built by what you repeat today. This is the habit code. Not a theory, but a structure that governs behavior. And now that you can see it, you are no longer inside it unconsciously. You are observing it. And what can be observed can be changed. Not instantly, but intentionally. Not through force, but through design. From this point forward, every habit becomes a choice of direction. Every repetition becomes a building block. Every system becomes a design decision. And your life becomes something you no longer drift through, but something you actively construct. This is where control begins. Not changing everything at once, but in understanding everything clearly and acting accordingly. Conclusion: mastering the habit code. By the time you reach this point, one idea should be impossible to ignore. Your life is not a series of random events. It is a structured output of repeated systems. Everything you experience on the surface is being generated by something deeper. Invisible loops. Automatic patterns. Reinforced behaviors. This is the habit code in its purest form. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Because what once looked like personality now looks like a pattern. What once looked like choice now looks like conditioning. What once looked like fate now looks like repetition. This shift is not meant to overwhelm you. It is meant to clarify reality. Because confusion is what keeps systems in control. And clarity is what breaks them. Now you understand that habits are not small actions. They are the architecture of identity. They decide what feels normal. They decide what feels difficult. They decide what feels possible. And over time, they decide who you become. But the most important realization is this. Nothing in this system is fixed. Not your habits. Not your identity. Not your direction. Everything is being maintained through repetition. And anything that is maintained can be changed. Not instantly. Not effortlessly. But deliberately. Through awareness. Through structure. Through consistent redesign. You have seen how cues trigger behavior before thought. How repetition turns actions into identity. How the environment shapes decisions before awareness. How discipline alone cannot sustain change. How systems outperform motivation. How small improvements compound into transformation. And most importantly, how the future is already being built by what you repeat today. This means one thing. You are not waiting for your life to change. You are actively producing it. Whether you realize it or not. So the real question is no longer what do I want? The real question is what am I currently building through repetition? Because every habit is a vote for a future version of you. And every repeated action strengthens that version. Now you stand at a point of awareness most people never reach. You can see the system. You can see the loops. You can see the structure behind behavior. But awareness alone is not the goal. Application is. Because understanding the habit code without applying it still leaves you inside it. So the shift now is responsibility. Not as pressure, but for clarity. You now know that change does not come from waiting. It comes from designing. Not from hoping, but from structuring. Not from forcing moments of discipline, but from building systems that make discipline unnecessary. This is where transformation becomes real. When you stop reacting to habits and start designing them. When you stop trying to change yourself in the moment and start shaping the conditions that define you over time. When you stop chasing motivation and start building inevitability. Because the truth is simple. Your life is not controlled by what you intend. It is controlled by what you repeat. And once you accept that fully, the path forward becomes clear. You do not need to change everything today. You only need to begin changing direction. One habit. One system. One repetition at a time. Because over time, repetition becomes identity. And identity becomes life. This is the habit code. Not something you learn once, but something you live every day. And now, you are no longer blind to it. Final words. Before you leave, understand this. You didn't just listen to an audiobook. You've been exposed to a system that has been quietly shaping your entire life. And now, you see it. You see the patterns. You see the loops. You see how repetition has been writing your identity in the background. That awareness alone puts you ahead of most people. But this is where it matters most. What you do next will decide everything. Because knowledge without action turns into illusion. And awareness without application fades back into autopilot. So don't let this be another moment that feels powerful. And then disappears. Use it. Start small if you need to. But start deliberately. Because every habit you repeat from this moment forward is a vote for the person you are becoming. Continue your transformation journey. If this audiobook shifted the way you think, then don't stop here. Go deeper into the system. Reinforce your awareness. Strengthen your mindset. Break the patterns from multiple angles. Start with these powerful audiobooks. The Comfort Zone Trap. Why safety is slowly destroying your potential. The Awakening Mind. Why most people are living on autopilot and don't know it. The Fear Barrier. Why you're stuck and how fear is controlling your life. The life you're not living. What happens when you never take the risk? Reprogram your limits. Break free from the invisible rules holding you back. Each one builds on the other. Each one reveals another layer of the system. Coming next. Your next breakthrough is closer than you think. The Identity Loop. Why you can't change your habits, even when you try. This is where everything connects. You'll understand why change feels so difficult. Why do you fall back into old patterns? And how identity itself can trap you in cycles you don't even notice. This next audiobook will take you deeper than ever before. Before you go. If this message impacted you, even slightly, take 10 seconds right now. Like this video. Comment your biggest realization. Share this with at least 7 people who need to hear this. And subscribe to Mind Lab Audiobooks. Because the more you engage, the more this message spreads. And the more people break out of unconscious patterns. This isn't the end. This is the moment you stop living on autopilot. And start designing your life with intention. Stay aware. Stay intentional. And I'll see you in the next audiobook.